Lecturer here at RMIT School of Media and Communication, and I'm also a co-director of the Screen and Sound Cultures research group here. I've been wondering, how might I introduce Dennis Altman this morning in the context of this conference? I was wondering, should I highlight the significance of his work as a pioneering gay rights activist, his first book being Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, published in 1971, with reprints in 93 and again in 2012. It's had a huge impact, not just here in Australia, but also on an international scale, as many of us will know. When I was recently rewatching, in preparation, I was saying to Dennis, I'm probably overthinking this intro this morning, but I did have a rewatch of the notable appearance of his in 1972 on ABC's Monday Conference. I was watching it on YouTube, and I thought I'd take a look at, I just couldn't resist, looking at some of the comments below, which included somebody saying, years ahead of his time. Another said, this man is one of the reasons why I'm allowed to hold my girlfriend's hand in public without shame. His ideas helped shape the views of generations to come. Another one, this man is one of the things we must all aspire to be, fighting for the truth and going against the tide just to make everyone's future a better place. It can often be a challenge as a researcher to position oneself in the context of the research, but I think that Dennis has excelled at this throughout his career. When working with my media students on their research projects in my own work, these are huge undertakings for these students in a short semester where the pressure is really on for them to write a lot of words in a short amount of time. And I find myself encouraging them that while it's important to get those words down on the page, it's also important to have some experiences to write about. They're doing reflective practice. This is a very difficult thing to do in 12 weeks, let alone, a much longer amount of time. In some of my own more recent work, I've been trying to balance the same sorts of things. And that's just one of the reasons that brings me here to introduce Dennis this morning. I often think that as a teacher, a researcher, a filmmaker, myself, someone engaged in trying to make this a better and fairer world, especially for those on the margins of society, and even as a human being who loves, who has disagreements, who has friendships, how can one draw these experiences together? How might one find the time to do all of this and also make some sort of an impact? So Dennis has spent his life writing about many of the tensions that exist in our society and offering his own experiences of these tensions. How does one exist being wedged between activism and academia, between living one's life and then writing about it? Not just in a useful way, but a very impactful one. What might happen to these tensions in the future? As I said, I probably overthought that introduction, but I'm very glad to have Dennis here, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you this morning. Please make him feel welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to start just by acknowledging that I'm very conscious of the reality that we're on colonial land, colonised land, and that this remains one of the most essential parts of unfinished business for us in this country. And for me, it's a particularly complicated question because this is also the country that provided refuge to my parents who came here as refugees and had to leave as well their own homelands. I also am very aware that I'm speaking in some ways as someone with a great deal of privilege. As an older gay white man, senior academic position, and that gives me certain access that is not always available for many of the people who are part of this conference. For me, and Patrick touched on this in ways that I hadn't anticipated, so I'm very grateful to him, I think that what I really want to tease out in different ways is the fact that we have to both speak from experience, but that experience by itself is not sufficient. That we need lived experience, we also need theory. We need the ability to read and to listen to people whose experiences are different to ours, and we need to be willing to think theoretically about how to make sense of very different perceptions of the world. I'm somewhat troubled by the current vogue for oral histories, which seems to assume that if you want to know what happened, all you have to do is collect large numbers of reminiscences, and that will somehow lead you into a full historical understanding. And I think the reason that I raise this is that very recently a book has been published, which is The History of the AIDS Council of New South Wales. And it's an extremely interesting collection of first-hand material, a lot of archival sources, a lot of interviews, but without any reference whatsoever to 30 years of writing and thinking that has gone on by people trying to make sense in a larger way of the AIDS HIV epidemic. And I was very struck by the current vogue, which is to assume that the activist story and the academic perception of that story live in two quite distinct spheres. Whereas for me, what is important is to find ways of bringing them together. At the same time, I would, of course, insist that there is no such thing as theory, as social theory, that can exist independent of the theorist herself. The irony is that those of us who feel oppressed for whatever reason, who've suffered discrimination, who've been marginalised, are far more likely to acknowledge that we speak out of our positions than are those who benefit from the existing structures of power. So that one of the striking things, if you read the tirade of anger that fills the columns of the Australian newspaper, is the belief that somehow it is only people like us who think about our identities, whereas people in power somehow exist independent of their identities and in some homogenous liberal framework that denies their positionality. And I think it's very important to think through what we mean when we talk about identity politics, which has, of course, become one of the favourite words now used to attack social movements and activists in Western countries. I was fascinated that the President of Indonesia, in his address to the Australian Parliament yesterday, talked about the threat of identity politics. Now, when he was using that phrase, he was not, I think, using it to attack the groups that the editorialists of the Murdoch press use. He was, I think, referring to the increasing use by nationalist, religious and political figures to appeal to identity as a way of maintaining their power and excluding anybody who doesn't fit their image of the nation. And the President's speech reminds us that we live in a period when, in fact, the most obvious examples and uses of identity politics come not from Indigenous groups, queer groups, women, disabled. They come, in fact, from powerful autocratic rulers. Donald Trump, Modi, Netanyahu, Orban, all of them practice a politics which is based upon constantly appealing to a certain sort of national identity. And this, I think, is extremely important for us to bear in mind in the current debates, where too often we get saddled with somehow pleading for our identities, whereas the people with power manage to use the language without that critique. I should also have explained at the beginning, I am a very bad user of PowerPoints. And in fact, I'd said to Olivia, I'm not going to have any PowerPoints. But then I realised I am quoting from a number of people as I speak. And I thought it would be helpful to have the names of people up on the board, as some of them will not be known to you. And the first person I quote is Hua Hu-Su, who wrote in the New Yorker earlier this year that identity politics offers a voluntary response to an involuntary situation. Power structures beyond our grasp sort us according to categories not of our choosing. And that is, of course, true and accurate when it comes to the way in which marginalised groups need take control of the way in which we are defined by the larger society, by power structures, and need turn what are often derogatory and demeaning concepts and perceptions into ways of building political and social communities. But as I say, I think it is important to recognise that it is not only we on the margins who appeal to identity, and that identity now is a central factor running across both right and left wing perceptions of power and politics. And against that background, it seemed to me worth going back to the remarkably important phrase that Nancy Fraser introduced when she talked about the need for a politics both of recognition and of redistribution. And in that one phrase, I think she brings together something that is enormously important and that often escapes people's understanding. So the conservative critique of the Uluru Statement, which argued, you don't need all this, you don't need treaties, you don't need recognition. What you need is better access to economic and social services, assumes that you can't have both, assumes that you cannot simultaneously have recognition of people's identity and greater equality in terms of their access to material goods. In the current world, I would want to add one other word to Nancy Fraser's statement, and that is sustainability. We need a politics of recognition, we need a politics of redistribution, we need a politics of sustainability. And the sort of politics that we will need going into the next few decades is one that manages to bring all three of those together, that recognises that, yes, sometimes we will speak as marginalised, as part of marginalised groups. At the same time, we will speak as inhabitants of a planet whose very survival is at stake. And having said that, I now want to try and tease out more specifically how the politics of sexuality might fit into this broader framework. And I want to say a little bit about sexuality, and then more specifically, because that was what I was asked to talk about the current state of queer politics, bringing it back to the tension between academia and activism. Let me begin by quoting two contemporary Latin American scholars. The first, Walter Mignolo, who wrote, "A colonial matrix of power is instituted through four interrelated spheres: control of the economy, of authority, of gender and sexuality, and of knowledge and subjectivity." And the reference to gender and sexuality is then taken up much more specifically in more detail by the Ecuadorian Manuela Peake, who writes, "The analysis suggests that codes of heteronormativity were central tenets of the colonial project. Sexuality was a terrain to frame the native as pervert and validate European violence against the non-Christian other, labelled as savage, heretic, and sodomite. The repression of sexual diversity shows how sexual control followed colonial logics of dispossession, like the doctrine of discovery, and why resisting heteronormative codification is a decolonial practice. What I think Manuela is getting at here is a very interesting irony. In the centuries of European colonialism, part of the colonial mission saw itself as taming and, quote, civilizing other peoples. And as European colonists, settlers, explorers, adventurers went out into what we now would call the lands of the South, they saw in their eyes unbridled sexuality which had to be controlled. So that part of the colonial project was to, in fact, enforce rigid norms of Christian morality upon people who were colonized. This, of course, didn't prevent the colonizers using colonial subjects for their own sexual pleasure. But hypocrisy is, after all, no stranger to political adventure. And the most obvious example of this in some ways was the institution right across the British Empire of the Victorian-era laws that criminalised homosexual behaviour. Now, the irony is, in the contemporary world, the countries of the North have now reversed this position. The South is now seen not as a place of unbridled sexuality, but as a place of unnecessary sexual repression, where attitudes and laws that ironically were brought by colonialism have been retained even as the colonial countries themselves have got rid of them. And nothing, I think, sums this up better and sums up the hypocrisy in this better than the recent statements of President Donald Trump that the United States wants to lead a global movement for the decriminalisation of homosexuality. Now, the politics behind this are partly connected to a couple of influential people in the Trump administration, but I think even more so they're connected with the desire to bash Iran over the head with anything they can find. And so the campaign against persecution of homosexuals, rather like the campaign against the persecution of women under the Taliban, is not born of a desire to genuinely see greater freedom for women and homosexuals. It is seen as a useful tool in maintaining a particular form of American foreign policy. But what strikes me is that in both the 19th century colonial missionary zeal and the 21st century desire to, quote, free or liberate people, there's a similar paternalism at work. And one of the things that we in the queer movement need to be very conscious of is that while, yes, of course, we want to give support, we want to work with people, with groups across the world who are struggling in very difficult situations, this can too easily become yet another form of Western intervention. And this, to me, is perhaps the single greatest issue that the queer movement faces. I should stress that I'm using the term queer deliberately because I am extremely uncomfortable with the alphabet soup that is now used. I do not want to start saying LGBTIQA and have someone from the audience leap up and say, but you forgot us. Luckily, the English language only has 26 letters, so presumably there is a logical end to how many acronyms can be added. But I think it's important to recognise that however many letters we add, we are in effect still working within a framework of understanding sexuality and gender that comes out of our Western experience, and is not necessarily appropriate in cultures that have different, often much more complex and much richer ideas of the interconnections between sex and gender. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the language of international law, when it talks about these issues, talks about sexual orientation and gender identity. And when I'm speaking in a context like this, I prefer to use the term queer as a catch-all. And I say this because it is important to recognise that across the world, people are raped, are murdered, are tortured because their sexuality, their gender identity does not fit what R.W. Connell a long time ago defined as hegemonic masculinity. And this is, I think, a particular challenge for us as a country in which there have been quite remarkable achievements towards greater acceptance and diversity on the sexual and gender scale. It's a real challenge for us because of what is going on in some of the countries in our immediate region. And while I can applaud President Joko's statements on identity politics, I really wish somebody had asked him while he was in Australia about the growing state-sanctioned homophobia that is now happening in Indonesia, where there have been increasing virulent attacks upon people who do not fit the heterosexual masculinist mode of appropriate sexual and gender behaviour. And I think that we in Australia are just at the beginning of thinking through how we can best contribute to a global movement without either imposing our values upon people of different cultures, but at the same time recognising that when people are being rounded up, arrested, tortured, as happened to men in Chechnya over the last couple of years, there's a real need for us to find ways of mobilising support. Having said that, let me then come back to what I think was billed as the topic of my talk, and I've deliberately moved away from that, and that is to think a little bit about our role as academics and activists. And this is, of course, the perfect place to talk about this, because this conference has been deliberately designed, as I understand it, to bring together those two worlds. And I'm actually going to read, which I very rarely do, but I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from something I'd written elsewhere because I think they sum up the point I want to make. I should begin by saying I'm old enough to have come out of a period when the women's and gay movements of the 1970s saw a coming together of people that created a group of people who, in Gramsci's language, were organic intellectuals. That is, people who worked intellectually, worked either in or outside the academy, but worked with ideas, but at the same time worked closely within social movements. And I recognise the danger of nostalgia in harking back to a mythical past of organic intellectuals striding between academia and the barricades. I also recognise that the academic environment has changed considerably. Yes, it is easier to be out in most academic settings, at least in the West, but the pressure to publish in approved journals means that academics have less time and incentive to write for anyone other than their professional colleagues. At the same time, the professionalisation of the movement, which now supports numerous well-funded organisations with full-time staff, means increasing interactions with governments and international organisations and less dependence on academics for ideas and research support. Increasingly, the publications of well-funded community organisations depend heavily on reports from other organisations, not from academic researchers. The tradition of the organic intellectual lives on in many poorer countries, where it is harder to shelter from political realities in the rarefied world of refereed papers and citation indices. All of you in this audience who work in universities will be very aware of the pressures of which I'm speaking. And I have been very struck by the way in which the turn to queer studies, which has produced some extraordinarily interesting and revealing ways of reading and understanding things that were taken for granted, has also increased the gap between activists and academics. I recall a long time ago, now over 20 years, I guess, I went to the first Queer Zagreb conference, quite amazing gathering because it was taking place in the shadows of the civil wars that had torn the ex-Yugoslavia apart, at which the local folks called themselves queer in formal discussions and lesbian and gay when they were talking about their actual lives. And I'm very aware of the difficulty for many activists, particularly in countries where there remain real restrictions and repressions, of dealing with a literature that is often written in a language so opaque that only people who have done graduate studies in literature actually understand what the theorists are saying. And this is not just a simple plea to say, write more simply. I recognise that there is virtue often in working through complexities that doesn't allow itself to be translated into simple sentences. But it is a plea to recognise that there needs to be an ongoing dialogue whereby both activists and academics think more than I suspect is currently the case about what we can learn from each other. And maybe the bridge that can help us do this is the emphasis on cultural representation that might go beyond the written and the spoken word. When I was looking through the program of this conference, one of the things that I found so interesting and so exciting was that it allows for a range of cultural performances, that it has integrated them into the conference. And that to me is enormously important. I'm used to the big international AIDS conferences, which like to believe that they are scientific. And scientific is defined in very traditional, empirical, positive ways. Culture for them is what you do in the evening when you've done the serious science during the day. For me, culture might actually be the serious stuff you should be doing during the day. And I remember when we did the big international AIDS conference in Melbourne in 2014, I organised an event which had to be held at the Wheeler Centre because they didn't really want it in the body of the conference, where we had 4 writers talking about how they, as creative writers, had responded to the reality of the AIDS epidemic. And that, to me, was a far more important and meaningful analysis than a great deal of what passed as scientific in Jeff's shed down the road. And I would want to put in a special plea for reading novels, because I am so struck by the fact that I know lots of activists, I know lots of social scientists, most of whom tell me almost proudly they never read a novel. Now that to me, you know, I'm old. For my generation, we learnt about being gay by reading novels. And I was enormously blessed to have got to know some of the most important novelists of the generation before me who opened up a world. But I think for everybody today who wants to come to terms with the underlying meanings of political change, who wants to come to terms with the fact that politics, activism, is not purely a rational action. We need to understand the emotional and the affective. Read fiction. And there is a lovely quote that Doris Lessing uses, where she says, "There's no doubt that fiction tells us more of the truth." There's another quote, and I didn't put Murray Kempton's name up on the board, but a long time ago, Murray Kempton, who was a well-known political journalist in the United States in the 1990s, wrote, "The novelist can always teach us more than the political scientist, because the realm called fiction is ruled by what is real, and the territory called fact has to make do with the dubities of the fancied." Now, we might get anxious at this in a world in which, of course, the President of the United States has abolished facts. And we know that facts no longer matter. But I think Murray Kempton was not subscribing to that at all. What he is saying, what Doris Lessing is saying, what a novelist like China Miéville, who I think is one of the great literary figures of this century, is saying, is there are ways of understanding, deeply understanding, the motives, the emotions, the feelings, the passions of the political that we only gain by reading fiction. And I will freely acknowledge that I think my greatest regret in life is that I have not been able to be a successful writer of fiction, and so have fallen back on what is perhaps the next best thing for someone who's got an academic career, namely to write out of my own experience and to write autobiographically. And I'm going to end because authors have no shame. You may as well know this. There are people in this room who teach creative writing at RMIT, so you should reassure your students, authors have no shame, and they plug their latest books. And the reason I wanted to plug my latest book is that one of the reasons I wrote that book is explained, I think, by the sentence that came to me that actually led me into writing Unrequited Love. And the sentence was, "The weekend before Donald Trump was elected, my cat died." And that led on to a story. I was in LA. Thomas the cat was being looked after by friends back in Melbourne. It brought together in a very real way for me the reality that how we see and understand the political is always personal. That we all know the slogan, "The personal is political," but the political is also the personal. That is, none of us can detach ourselves, can make an artificial distinction between our own immediate experience of life and the larger world in which we want to be actors. And I've found it, as someone who is employed in a politics department, increasingly difficult to know how we write about politics in an era where everything seems to be changing, where old assumptions seem to be collapsing, where there appears to be a growing tide of very unpleasant, authoritarian, masculinist rule across the world. And for that reason, I found writing honestly out of one's own experience, but then trying to link it to what other people have written, to what other people have experienced, to what I hear other people's lives consist of, is for me now the best way of approaching political analysis. So I think at that point, Patrick, I'm not sure if you need to come up, or am I meant to call for questions? I was told that I think we have light. I put this back on because I think it gives us light. Yeah, that's better. So if there are any questions, I'm not quite sure how we manage. Yes, Patrick has a roaming mic. That's much better. I apologise. When you're standing up here, you have to do this to see what's happening. And I don't know if there are any questions or comments, but Patrick's up there with the mic. And I think we do.
Thank you so much. I firstly want to tell you how grateful I am to hear you speak.
Sorry, I can't hear. Can you?
You can't hear me? Is that
That's better? Yeah.
I just want, Victoria Grieve-Williams, I just want to thank you so much for what you've said today. And just on a personal note, I'm a straight woman who admired you from afar for your activism. And, you know, I felt that breaking the gender binary was a really important new horizon that had to be breached. I think it's just one of the, you know, people talk, you know, back in the day, people were very concerned about race, but gender was something I was always aware of in my own family and personal life. And you know, I'm very admiring of a person who can combine academic work and activism in the way you have. And you call yourself an accidental activist. I just wonder if you could tell us how you accidentally came across the importance of being an activist.
So, you know, I'm always very reluctant to call myself an activist, which is probably why I like the term accidental. My first real experiences of activism were in the anti-Vietnam movement. And I think my greatest single moment of activism, or, you know, the moment that I remember with the greatest sense of pride, perhaps, is the moratorium in Sydney in, I think, either 70 or 71, where I remember I was able to speak on the town hall steps in Sydney and looking out over, you know, tens of thousands of people. And that to me was such a powerful moment, not because I was speaking, but because that sense that you could bring together tens of thousands of people in opposition to what our government was doing. I fell into the gay movement. You know, Geoffrey Weeks, who is the leading British scholar of queer sexuality, Geoffrey once said that I had had very good timing, and he was absolutely right. I mean, I fell into the gay movement in New York because I went there in 1971 on leave. I just started teaching, and Sydney University gave me a few months off, and I needed somewhere to live. And I ended up sharing an apartment that turned out to be the place where the first gay liberation paper in New York, Come Out, was produced. So suddenly, without my having to do anything, I was part of the collective. And because I wanted to write, that then led to me writing a book. And the book, again, the timing was very lucky. And, you know, it's for people who write, it's important to recognise that you can write a very good book, and if the timing is wrong, it will die. And you can write a not very good book, but if it hits the right moment, it will live. I don't want to discourage people, but I think that is the reality about publishing we all need to understand. So I think that the other thing I'd say is it was a lot easier in the 70s and 80s to combine an academic career with activism. And the classic case was Lex Watson, who was the most important gay activist in New South Wales throughout that period. Lex was a colleague of mine at Sydney University. Lex published virtually nothing. Lex was constantly in trouble for not getting essays marked in time. In the modern university, he would have been kicked out. But in fact, universities then had more room, more scope for people who did a range of things. And I think one of the things that I find most depressing is the current pressure on people, not just to publish, which I accept is actually part of what academics should do, but the pressure to publish in the right journals. And the right journals are often journals where you will be read by 3 people, 2 of whom are the people who review your article. If you write a leading article in the New York Review of Books, which will be read by hundreds of thousands of people across the world, it won't count as much in your academic profile. So yes, I think, I would say my activism was a combination of circumstance, of the fact that luckily I wrote a book at a time where that gave me access to media, and that then got me called an activist, and as I say, a term I've never been totally comfortable with.
G'day. I've just got a quick question. How do you see the future in terms of queer activism, say, in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sorry, I'm struggling. The mic is...
Dennis, the question was, where do you see queer activism going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Look, I think we're living in a very interesting period, and that there's been a huge upsurge of queer organising across a whole range of issues. And there are 2 things that I see that I think are most interesting. One is the emergence of a very strong trans movement. And the way in which trans people are challenging common sense assumptions about what it means to be a man or a woman is, I think, clearly the most revolutionary part of sexual politics in the contemporary world. And it's not something that I think we would have foreseen even 10 years ago, but it is now becoming, I think, a really significant factor. And of course, if we take the trans critique of gender seriously, if we say gender is not binary, gender is fluid, then the whole homo-hetero divide breaks down anyway. It doesn't make sense once you think of gender not as 2 fixed categories, but as a continuum over which people might move in a lifetime. The other thing that's going on, so that I think is the revolution or the radical end of what's going on, and I'm now talking about what's happening in Australia, right? The other end of it, the respectable end, is the development of quite serious infrastructure. And when I say that, I'm thinking particularly of the fact that in Melbourne, the state government has put $20 million into building a community centre in Fitzroy Street, St Kilda. Again, something we wouldn't have imagined, I think, even 10 years ago. And in the space between those 2, there's a huge range of things going on. Now, I would say one more thing that for me is the issue that I'm most passionate about. There will be more and more people across the world who are going to be seeking asylum, who are going to be fleeing as refugees because of their sexuality or their gender orientation. Australia has not been a particularly welcoming country for these people. And if there were one thing I would ask our government to do, and yes, of course, I would like a different government to ask, but we have to deal with the ones who are there, at least for the moment. I would like Australia to become known as a place that welcomes people who need asylum because of that. And that, to me, is where I would most like to see our energies as a movement go. And there are the beginnings of groups and organisations, often made up of refugees themselves in Australia, who are working very hard to try and increase and change our attitudes in ways that I think are enormously important and need support.
One up the back here.
Yeah, Dennis, you touched on the issue of sustainability, and I think it's a very important issue, along with the issue of redistribution, addressing inequality. And you also finished up touching about refugees. Now, if the Australian government is worried about a few boatloads of refugees coming in from wherever, what is going to happen when the glaciers in the Himalayas have melted? And we're going to be talking about millions of refugees from South Asia and East Asia and elsewhere, perhaps even Africa, trying to get into the global north, which includes, of course, Australia. So I mean, there are a lot of issues we can deal with, but I think that's a extremely important issue that we academics and even activists have only started to grapple with, but there's so much more to do. Any thoughts?
I don't know how I can what I can say other than yes, of course, you're right. There are looming issues on a scale that we haven't had to deal with. That require us to reimagine the world in ways that I think are extremely painful. I don't accept the argument that we can move to a zero emissions, that we can move to zero emissions target without pain. I mean, we see both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese falling over themselves constantly, doing these somersaults to try and persuade us that we can get there, but nothing's going to change, when nobody's going to have to give up anything. I think that's nonsense. And I think, you know, what you say is absolutely correct. And part of what we are going to have to accept is that there will be movements of people of large numbers. And we as a country that has the capacity to settle very many more refugees than we currently do are going to have to come to terms with that. But I think that the first step in all of this, which, you know, goes back to the sustainability argument, is to try and stop this idea. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw the Q&A last night, but there is this very strong desire to keep saying, you know, we can do all of this, nobody's going to have to change anything. Your lives are all going to get better. I don't feel that optimistic.
Hi, my name is Tanya, and I'm also from the University of Sydney. First, I would like to say, can you hear me? Or just trying to see. First, I'd like to thank you for acknowledging the continued coloniality of the way we think about gender and sexuality, and of course also the contingencies of the letter soup as well as the term queer. I'm wondering, and you touched upon it a little bit, but I'm wondering, at this conference, one thing that is coming up very often is solidarity, right? Solidarity partnerships, solidarity movements. And I think as academics and accidental activists or deliberate activists in the global north, we do have a responsibility to support and not undermine LGBT struggles or queer struggles in the global south. But what are your thoughts on how we do that without perpetuating epistemic violence, essentially? And I'm thinking, for instance, in reading up on movements, it's like basically...
Sorry, I'm going to stop you because I really am having real problems because of the mic. I'm not hearing clearly what your question is.
Well, in short, it's like, how do we avoid, as academics in the global north, to perpetuate epistemic violence in our support in the global south? And I'm just linking that with, for instance, the general assertion that the D movement, also just that we talk in the singular, the LGBT or queer movement started sort of with the Stonewall uprising, which is again a very Eurocentric notion, or that the queer trajectory is, you know, same-sex marriage, adoption, and this whole, again, heteronormative matrix that we're just perpetuating, and it's essentially an assimilist agenda. So I'm like, how do we avoid in forming solidarity partnerships between the global north and the global south, perpetuating these kind of epistemic violences?
Patrick, can you sum that up in one sentence? Because I'm sorry, I am having acoustic problems.
So it was about how do we sort of reconcile these different perspectives between the global north and the global south? Yes? In a very reductive way.
No, I understand.
In solidarity.
I'm really sorry because it sounded really interesting, but I was struggling to get the nuance. By listening, by not assuming that what we do is always better, by understanding that there are political, cultural, social traditions in other cultures from which we might learn, rather than assuming that somehow we in the global north have the answers for the global south. And I can give you a specific example of what I think is really bad practice. And that is, a couple of years ago, you may remember a couple of guys were publicly flogged in Aceh, in Indonesia, for having sex together. And suddenly my Facebook feed was full of people saying we should boycott tourism to Bali. Now, the ignorance this showed about the range of and diversity of Indonesia itself shocked me. But what shocked me even more was there are lots of groups in Indonesia. And before we start saying what we should do, go talk to them, ask them what they think would be helpful and what would not be counterproductive. And in the end, I think, if I understand your question right, I think the most important thing we have to do is, before we act, ask, are we doing this to make us feel good? Or are we doing this because people in those countries will actually benefit and have asked us to do it? And we can talk afterwards, because I have a feeling I just didn't pick up everything you said. I'm sorry.
I think we have time for one more question before we break for morning tea, if there is one. Yeah, down here.
Okay, my curiosity is, how did you? Okay, maybe I'm just gonna shoot my voice. I really appreciated your talk about writing autobiography.
No, use the mic. I was just.
Oh, okay. I appreciated your writing autobiographically in your discussion. How did you figure out that was your purpose as an academic, to write autobiographically?
How?
Like, how did you figure out you were to write, or that was your method or your way of being an academic?
I think it's always been for me the natural way of writing. I have, of course, written stuff that is not in any way autobiographical, but I don't know if it's because of my ego, or it's because, I'd say it's a combination of ego, but also of a recognition of partiality. That is, that none of us can detach ourselves, if we want to comment on the social, the political, from who we are. So for example, I've been a strong believer when I've supervised graduate students. I've always said to them, what you have to do is you have to write something that explains why you as a person want to spend 3 years studying this topic. That may not even end up in the final thesis, but you need to know that, and you need to explore that. And I would say that this is a very important act, that we need to interrogate ourselves and try and locate our own biases, because none of us can be without bias. None of us can not bring into our analysis the hurts and the wounds, but also the advantages and the privileges that we have. And that, in the end, I think is something that I do feel strongly about. And and that has helped me, I think, as a writer, although unfortunately perhaps not as a novelist.
Thank you very much, Denise. Please join me in thanking.